I'm so delighted that you have joined us for Us, Past, Present, Future, which is a series designed to generate conversations about subjects of interest to all of us. I'm Beth Kelly and have the honor to serve as Vice President for Education, Research, and Interpretation at Colonial Williamsburg. This month, our conversation is about a woman's place. When thinking about the past, what image do you have for a woman's place? Does the image include spinning wheels, open hearth cooking, nurturing children? I'd say that's a fair image. But there were surprising exceptions. Women property owners, women serving in government-appointed positions, mothers who were enslaved and fighting the highest court for their children's freedom, and high-ranking American Indian women making decisions on behalf of their entire community. Those were all realities of a woman's place in 18th century Williamsburg. The home I am in embodies the complexity of a typical story of lives intertwined. The women who moved about this room and lived on this property were mothers, sisters, and daughters, but they were divided by their social status. White and black, enslaved and free, they experienced life very differently and faced different challenges. Legally in the 18th century, very few women had the power to affect their own lives and make societal choices for themselves. Exploring even more deeply, Black female Virginians who were enslaved had no control over their own lives and certainly no control over their own bodies. History shows us numerous examples of when these circumstances were the case. And yet, this founding generation of women with limited or no freedom had tenacity to overcome adversity and persevere. They developed their own methods for finding control within their lives while continuing to nurture future generations of Americans. The past reveals the powerful character of the American women, and for us, a better understanding of the place or places they find themselves today. Our panelists will begin a conversation with you, but we encourage you to continue that conversation in your own community. What are the contributions women are making in your community? And are there ways to help them overcome the challenges they face? Our past is shared. We can't separate it out based on race, gender, or ethnicity. Our present is shared. By understanding one another's perspectives, we can build our shared future. Thank you again for joining us.
Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you all so much for joining us today for Us, Past, Present, and Future, A Woman's Place. And today we will be speaking about women of the 18th century and women of today. My name is Jamar Jones. I'm happy to join you all today from the Hennage Auditorium at the Art Museums of Colonial Williamsburg, where we are streaming live. And I have the pleasure and the privilege of being joined by a fantastic panel, including Barb Watson, Rose McAfee, and Dr. Kelly M. Brennan. And so how about we all take a little bit of time and get to know our panelists. Kelly, how about we start with you? Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name is Kelly Brennan, and I'm one of the historians here at Colonial Williamsburg. I got my PhD from the College of William and Mary in 2014. The thing I need to say when I introduce myself in this sort of situation is the thing that I say to my students and the thing that I say to our frontline staff. It is not my job to make you feel good. My responsibility is to the people of the past and to make sure their story is told accurately and as fully as is possible.
Thank you. I like that. Rose, please tell us about your journey and what brings you here.
Well, I'm retired from Colonial Williamsburg after 32 years. Started off as a frontline interpreter, moved my way up to a supervisor. My last position was training specialist / historian. That's when we had a whole bunch of hats that we wore back in those days. And I'm so excited to be back working with evening programs and doing wonderful things like this, being able to share some of the knowledge and experience that I gained in my 32 years here at Colonial Williamsburg. So I'm excited to be able to give back.
Yeah. We're excited to have you back.
Thank you.
And Barb, please, what brings you here and what's some of your journey?
Well, to be honest, and I did mention it before, but one of my first jobs was with Colonial Williamsburg. So that's kind of exciting that I get to come back in this aspect. Currently, I am the Assistant Director for Social Services for James City County. Also the Vice President of Altogether, which is a nonprofit organization that's been around over 20 years. And our role is to help bring people together across racial, ethnic, and cultural lines for better understanding and conversation. And then lastly, I am also the co-owner and instructor at a fitness center here in the Williamsburg area and also in Newport News. So thanks for having me.
All right, thank you, thank you. I am certainly glad to be in your company today. Now, of course, today we are going to be talking about women of the past, the present, and the future. So please be sure to get your questions, your comments, concerns going right into our comment section, and we will be happy to answer as many of your questions as possible throughout our program. So we're looking forward to hearing from you all and interacting with you soon. Now, to get us started, you know, they say you have to know where you've come from in order to know where you're going, right? So, Kelly, I'd like to pose a question to you and see if anyone in the panel would like to speak on it, but can you describe for us what the life of an average woman during the 18th century was, and the air quotes were intentional?
Good. One of the things we have with people who come visit us here at Colonial Williamsburg or enjoy our social media is there's always this expectation of what's the average. Because as modern Americans, people study what's the average, weight or age or whatever it may be to get to something that we can think of as average. But as we live our own lives, we know that you may fit into certain demographics, but just because you fit in those demographics doesn't mean you're anything like other people who, quote unquote, are like you, as strange as that may sound. And because of this, there is no such thing as average, because everything is going to depend on race and age and geographical location and so many other factors that we don't necessarily take into account all the time, but we know were important in the 18th century. I will give you some numbers, though, because we got to do a little bit of averages. Everyone would be disappointed if we didn't. 1775, we know in the city of Williamsburg, half the population, well, 52%, was African American or of African descent. The other 48 were white. The number that I think matters the most, and I'd love to see us talk about it more in social media and in our programming, would be the 27.5% that are the African American women. They are the largest group in the city of Williamsburg in 1775. And I think that's something that we should talk about more, and I know, Rose, you feel the same way.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Yes. So you were saying that.
Yes, I would say, please, if you would love to expand upon some of the demographics of the time period, we would love to hear more about that. And also, what might be some things that our audiences may be surprised to know about these 18th century women?
Well, I think Kelly really touched on the demographics, but I think one of the things that I think people would be surprised about is that women had agency. They did not wait to be acted upon. Even though they were restricted by class and race and law, they still were able to maneuver within that society and still make ways for themselves and for their family especially.
Mm-hmm. Now, we're speaking a lot about the women of the time period. Now, we definitely want to kind of move into this idea of what was it like for these women to exist in this time in relationship to the law. Mm-hmm. And also, so I'm curious to hear some of your perspectives about that and how women navigated the law, and also what did the law say about different women?
Mm-hmm. Sure, I'll start. There are a bunch of things about the legal system in the 18th century that actually rolls into the 19th century, but they begin to dismantle elements of it in the 20th. One of the things that is so important in the 18th century, and this affects the lives of all women, whether they're explicitly stated in these laws or not. The English tradition coming out of common law is going to be the coverture. So the idea, if a woman is married, she is covered by her husband. She and her husband are considered one legal entity. So this means things like she can't sue or be sued on her own behalf. She can't own property in her own name under most circumstances. She is restricted because the thought is someone else is taking care of these pieces. Then you have femme sole, which sounds like what you'd think, women who are alone. They're given opportunities, things like selling property, they can sue and be sued. They're responsible for themselves legally in a way that I think surprises visitors. Now, a lot of this goes back to issues surrounding property, right? I said buy, not being able to buy. The other one is being property. And that's going to be a very important element under the law because it changes the way African American women navigate the world. But those other differences as well are going to create these huge departments, these branches off into the way women, I should say specifically, experience life in the 18th century.
One example of that agency that I was talking about is Mary Aggie. In 1723, she petitioned the legislature. Well, she actually chose benefit of clergy when she was up in a court case. Benefit of clergy basically means that if you can read one passage out of the Bible, then you could be pardoned in effect. And that's what she did. That was the first time an African Virginian or woman had claimed benefit of clergy, so much so that the folks here in Virginia actually had to write to the Bishop of London to say, hey, is this applicable? And the Bishop of London said, yes, it is. And that not only opened up benefit of clergy for enslaved people, but also for women as well. So she worked within the law, but I think it's really fascinating. She had to know about benefit of clergy in order to claim it. So that's what I'm talking about, that agency and that resilience and resourcefulness of women.
Absolutely, and I would love to hear more about women like Mary Aggie, because it seems as if she really was able to enact a lot of change for future women, and also she directly had impact with the law and shifting the law.
Absolutely.
But I do want to go back. I'm curious to know, Barb, I know you do a lot of great work in the James City County area, the Williamsburg area at large. We spoke a little bit about the demographics of the 18th century. Are those demographics the same in regarding women today in the area?
Well, primarily, currently in the Williamsburg area, about 16% of the population between 14 and 16 are African American, and the remainder are Caucasian. And currently also over 50% of the population of the historic area is women. So women are very prominent here in the area, and kind of tying it to the past, women continue to have to be resourceful in ensuring that they have the ability to do the things that they want to do. I mean, there's still instances, and not necessarily just to the Williamsburg area, but generally where it's difficult for a woman to buy a house or buy a car or even have utilities in their own name. So while there have been improvements in the abilities of women to do wonderful and marvelous things, there still are some restrictions.
Indeed. And I love that idea about you speaking about women being resourceful. I'm certainly sure everyone watching, we know, at least from my standpoint, you all are the most resourceful, everything, praises. But I say that to say, I would love to hear from the panel. In the 18th century, did we see a lot of women taking on these leadership roles? Someone like Mary Aggie, directly, taking things from their inner sphere, right? But not realizing that they're trying to make change in their world, but hopefully making change for other women and others in their community. Can you all speak to that? Did that happen?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I think one of the things when you're talking about enslaved women is to also keep in mind that there were ways that they could resist that were passive. And that passive resistance could also be a way to influence. For instance, if you're the cook, your master doesn't want to make you mad and have to eat your food the next day. So you might have a little bit of influence in that respect. So there are ways that you can have leadership, but not in a formal sense. So I think, for instance, the enslaved foreman would be a leader, and his wife might also be a leader in the slave community, say, for instance, out of a place like Cartersville at a plantation. The cook might be a leader within the household enslaved people that are working in the house. So there are some, again, informal leadership positions that enslaved women could take that certainly would be beneficial to their families and eventually to their communities.
Yeah, I think the other important thing when we're talking about sort of this idea of leadership, that it's not just sort of mundane everyday leadership, it's also spiritual leadership. We know that the Baptist church in the late 18th century is in some ways very different from the modern church. And what you see to a certain extent is that women are serving in particular roles because the nature of the Baptist faith is still somewhat fluid in terms of how they, what they believe and how they believe it. And I think that this is another really important example, and we see this so with women who are free and enslaved black women, maybe participating in this process. We also know that there are white women, these gentry women, are doing something very similar. There's an instance where there is a boycott of British goods that takes place here in Williamsburg specifically. And that is something that the women basically spearhead and do themselves. This is not something that's been foisted upon them or there was a particular expectation. But we also have to remember all of these women are operating in a man's world, more or less. So there might be certain expectations of the nature of their leadership or how much leadership they have. But man, when they had it,
run with it.
Yeah.
Indeed. Now, Barb, you're coming from a world of working in the 21st century perspective, but I know, as you said, your first job was here, and so I'm certainly sure have connections right here to Colonial Williamsburg.
Absolutely.
But do you find that some of this history, some of the aspects of the lives that we're speaking about with these women, does anything still resonate with you today and your work and your involvement with women?
Well, I think, specifically, most of my career has been in the human services world. And I will say that, at least in the state of Virginia, the majority of, say, directors of social services are women. And so I think in those helping professions, whether it be social services, education, medical, oftentimes there are women in leadership. The one thing that I will say too, though, in regards is that we still have a long way to go as far as opportunities for women to be number one in the organizations that they are. Now like I said, we have come a long, long way, but we still have a long way to go. You're more likely to find a woman in the number 2 position than you are in number 1. So again, improvement is happening, but we've got to keep going, and women are they're fierce and they don't give up easily, and so this momentum is going to continue.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm looking forward to us delving deeper into what is to come and the future as we move along in our conversation for sure today. Now, I also want to continue to encourage our audiences to please send in questions as you have. We'll be happy to share them with the panel. I do have one question from Tony that I would love to get your thoughts on. Now, we've talked a lot about the women in the 18th century, but in your research, particularly Rose and Kelly, was there anything that has really resonated with you in your years of expertise that was surprising? That is what Tony would like to know.
Well, I remember reading about Elizabeth Key. She was actually, she lived in the 17th century before a number of the laws were actually put in place that restricted freedom of movement, personal rights, and conduct. And the law stated, quote unquote, Negroes, Indians, mulattoes. So it didn't separate slave or free, and it didn't separate Native Americans from enslaved people, or free black people for that matter. Elizabeth Key sued for her freedom. She was an indentured servant. She had completed her indenture. Her father was white. She married a white man, and she was a Christian. And so she sued for her freedom based on those factors, that her father was English, and in English law, the inheritance is gone through the father, whereas in Roman law, which is what slavery is based on, it goes through the mother. She was a Christian, and there was a law that said a Christian can't hold another Christian as its slave. And again, she was had the fluidity to marry a white man as well. That was in the 1650s. By 1662, the first law came on the books that closed those windows that she used. That first law was that the condition of the mother is passed on to the child, which makes slavery basically self-perpetuating in Virginia, again, based on Roman law. The second law that came about maybe 2 or 3 years later that said baptism does not alter your status, slave or free. So that window was also closed. Again, Elizabeth Key knew how to kind of maneuver, and she was able to kind of move through that window to get her freedom, but that window closed as more Africans are coming over directly from Africa, particularly starting in 1680, and more and more laws are coming on the books in the 80s all the way up to 1701, which was one of the first major slave codes where everything was pulled together in one area within the law. But Elizabeth Key was able to maneuver through that very brief window in order to get her freedom.
Wow.
So I think, again, that agency, and also knowledge. You had to know that you could do that in order to do it. And you had to know where to go, who to talk to. You had to maybe get a patron, someone who, was in higher authority and influence that could help your situation along the way. So again, the resilience and resourcefulness that you were talking about, absolutely.
Yeah. That's something to really think about, especially now we're living in an age where everything's at our fingertips, right? But it's really a testament to women like that, because they have to do so much more just to make so many more things happen. And how powerful is that, right?
That's true.
Yes. Now, I'm curious, there's and anyone feel free to jump in on this, a question from Maryland. She's very curious, and we've begun to start talking about it, the different levels of this is an interesting one to think about, but it's different framings of people's lives. And so one thing she's particularly curious about are these differences when it comes to wives, white wives of, say, plantation owners, of having, large populations of enslaved individuals versus someone who might be married to a tradesman, a poorer farmer or someone, and they might not have enslaved people. And what are some of those, probably a lot of gray areas, and she's curious about just some of those differences, and then maybe we can just expound upon that, about how that might affect people.
Okay. I like the fact that she brought up the idea that the plantations and the enslaved people, these massive numbers, you do see that in the 18th century. Robert Carter III is a good example of that. But that kind of setup is very 19th century. And the way it affects 19th century women is different because it's a different period. It's not, like I said, it's not that it never happened. It was just that setup with that hundreds and hundreds on this huge acre farm isn't common in the 18th century. Now, having said that, there are individuals who own a tremendous number of individuals. And yes, that's going to change the resources she has access to. Resources are a fundamental part of everything, really, we're going to say. 18th, 19th, 20th, 21st centuries, resources are so important to women's existence. So yes, she has more. Her resource, the depth of her resource is considerably greater versus, say, the tradesmen. Now, they're living very different kinds of lives. They're both white women, but their lives are different, as we talked about earlier, the idea that there is no sound. And I'm going to introduce a concept that is exactly what Marilyn's speaking to, the idea of intersectionality. And intersectionality, the word, was introduced in 1989 by Kimberly Crenshaw. And what she was looking to do, she was explaining the circumstances in which black women live and the nature of the oppression they experience because of it. It's very, she did it for an academic audience, but it's a concept we all understand, because the nature of Marilyn's question is, we've got a rich white woman, we've got a poor white woman. Their lives are going to be very different. Then you have, then you bring in race, then you bring in age, and what it ends up doing, it builds out from there, and begins to make it a little easier for us to understand why people were treated in certain ways. What oppression did they face, and sort of where did it come from, depending on who we're talking about. I love that question because she just nailed that bigger point home.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, absolutely. Now, there is one curiosity from Sue going even further, and we've spoken a little bit about this idea of what exactly does leadership look like? What does that mean? And Rose, I know you've spoken about agency. Well, did women have a lot of agency when it came to religion, and especially under different practices? Because we know at this time, during the Revolutionary War period, people are breaking away from the Anglican Church, and so you have Baptists and Methodists and Lutheran and so many other religious groups. But are there any examples that we see women really leading faith or religion at this time period in the 18th century?
But most of the examples that I've seen have been more 19th century, but I know if you might know some examples.
I can't think of someone specific. I can't say so-and-so here in Williamsburg.
Exactly.
But what I can say is, because all of those religions, that Methodist, Baptist, there's this huge shift change, right? And a big part of this is the Great Awakening. And what we see is a lot of things that had been settled, say, under the Church of England, there's a lot of upheaval, which means you see the way men and women interact with each other change, the way the racial relationships, particularly with the Baptists. So I would say in that sense we do see it, because all of this is still up for negotiation. Of course, as time goes on, they begin to look more like traditional, that in the style of the Church of England. They don't believe the same thing. They don't necessarily have the same power structure, but their expectation about the roles of men and the roles of women begin to solidify. So this is kind of an interesting time, because there is, I see what you're saying about 19th century, because that's another period, there's this huge upheaval.
Yeah, absolutely.
And whenever there's that religious upheaval for women of all backgrounds, it changes it changes the religious experience, right?
Exactly. Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. Now, Barb, do you have any, in dealing with the community now, have you seen any sort of shifting or women taking on leadership roles when it comes to faith practices or churches now in your experiences?
I will say that a good number of the churches within the community, there was a time, because I grew up here also, you wouldn't have found a female priest or the pastor of a church. And that has changed tremendously. So women are taking more of an active role in the community and in religious communities. And, and I think this is also kind of historical from the aspect of that was another way of caring for the community, that women were involved in their church communities to help support the needs of people in the community that needed additional resources. And so I think that just has, continued, and many grassroots efforts had women at the helm, because they were trying to address those human rights that were being ignored in many ways.
Yes, so thank you. Thank you all for that. Now, in our next segment, we'll bring our discussion forward in history. But first, let's learn a little more about those women of the 18th century.
In 1775, there were 906 women and girls living in the city of Williamsburg, half the population of the town. Most of them, 57%, were black, and 43% were white. Years later, in the 1780s, we know that a small number of women were listed as head of their household and owned businesses and property. 3 of these heads of household were free black women, but the vast majority of women and girls in Williamsburg were considered to be part of a man's household. None of these women in 18th century Williamsburg could vote, hold public office, or serve on a jury. All of them worked inside and outside the home. They all left the house to shop and socialize. They were all consumers, buying a wide variety of goods. But that's where their similarities end. We can't simply group all 18th century women together because gender isn't the only thing that matters. Just as modern women have different lives and experiences based on race, age, and economic status, 18th century women were no different. Marriage placed women under their husband's protection and authority. Most free married women, black and white, could not enter into contracts, sue, be sued, or own property separately from their husbands. Most of the property a woman brought into her marriage became her husband's. All free, unmarried women, usually widows, had more legal rights and could do many of the things that married women could not. They could own property, bring suits in court, and enter into legal contracts. White women had the most rights and opportunities, but they were still not equal to men. They could still be mistreated based on their gender or their economic status. Enslaved women had virtually no rights. By law, they passed their enslaved status on to their children. They could not legally marry, and their families could be separated at any time. Free black women lived in a world between free whites and enslaved blacks. Despite being free from the bonds of slavery, they still experienced racism and did not have the same rights and privileges as white women. They couldn't testify against a white person in court. And until 1769, married free black women were taxable, while married white women were not. Despite these legal and societal differences, all these women did their best to navigate a world that regarded them as inferior to men. They shared the same struggles that modern women still do, finding their place in society, carrying the emotional load of motherhood, and striving to make life better for themselves and their families.
Welcome back to Us, Past, Present, and Future, A Woman's Place. Now, if you're just joining us, we've been having a pretty great discussion, I'll say, about women of the 18th century and a lot of things that affected them, a lot of their circumstances at that time period. Now, one of the things we were talking about was how these identities intersect, especially during that time, and we definitely want to move it forward and see how these different experiences shaped not only the experiences of the women of the past, but how they're still influencing and affecting who women are today and their lives today. And so, Kelly, I was
just going to start with just going into intersectionality and how people in the past would have understood it.
Yeah.
So this is a concept, whenever I explain it to anybody, they're like, yeah, okay, that makes sense. It's like this is the distilling of that concept of depending on what the nature of your life is, the different pieces of demographics, the way you are treated is going to be different. And the nature of oppression someone's going to experience is going to be different. Intersectionality just takes all that I just said into one word. The question is sometimes it's like, oh, historians love to look at different things from different lenses, and they'll say a feminist lens or a Marxist lens, which are, not necessarily done quite the same way now, but these different lenses. And the one that I think is interesting when they'll say it's an intersectional lens, and people will complain. And the reason I think it's an appropriate way to do it is because they understood the concepts in the past. They knew that in the 18th century. They understood that an enslaved cook is going to be treated differently than an enslaved male field hand. They know that. They understand that those different pieces fit together to create somebody's circumstance. I don't think they'd probably get all grumpy about the oppression part because the way they're thinking about the world is different, but they would understand. And from that perspective, to me, I think it makes it a very useful way to look at history.
Indeed.
And when I think of intersectionality, I think about, that we often interpret or look at through a lens the past and people as if they were on a parallel train track, maybe with that third rail in the middle. That's the electrified one. That's those are the, the issues in the community that rise up and, But really, society is more like spaghetti. Because we're all, in this pot and we're mingling together, and there's a little, meatball over there, and there's some sauce over here, but it's messy. Yes. It's not neat and tidy, but that's just life. So that's what I think of when I think of intersectionality, all those ways that women, men, people in general interacted even within a slave society. And sometimes, and this might be controversial to say, but sometimes I think people interacted more in a slave society because they knew, you know, what the ramifications were, or what their limitations were, what their sphere was. Of course, people always operated outside that, but you know, that it was a different way of interacting in society.
Yeah. And you know, it's interesting. I think we all have probably witnessed a lot of conversations happening right now about how do we examine history? How do we examine where we've come from? And a lot of times you hear people say that we don't want to look at history through our 21st century perspective, but that is probably the whole purpose of why we even study history in the first place, right? Because we're trying to examine what was, to examine why we are now. So, and I open this to anyone, do you think it's odd for people to maybe use their lenses to say, I want to intentionally think about the intersectionality of the past? Or what would you say to people who say that it's odd to look at that concept?
I would probably say the fact that they understood the concept. Really, just the idea. No, they got it. They completely got it. This is not something. Now we're making a choice about the fact that they, you know, that we're making a choice about that's the thing we're going to focus on. But it's still at the same time, it's a lens that we can use as 21st century that connects immediately to not only 18. I mean, I don't even know how far you could go back. I'd say at the very least, it's the beginning of colonialization, probably well before that. And they know this. And I would say that would be my answer, would be they got it, we got it, we're going to be specific here, and that's okay.
And I think, too, the whole concept of, you know, that you mentioned, you know, that you have to know where you've been to see where you're going. So you really need to kind of look at, you know, what's happened before. How do I build on that, you know, and bridge the gap and bring in even more people and more perspectives into this discussion? You can't help but look through your lens. That's you know, you can't help it, you know, but you can be conscious of understanding that's what you're doing and the limitations of that. But I think it would be difficult not to look through your lens, because that's the lens that we have. That's based on our experience, our life experience.
Absolutely. So how did we get from there to here? Yeah, I know that's a pretty broad question, of course, but I would love to hear from you all about this idea of how has womanhood grown, and how has it developed and evolved from the 18th century to the 19th to here? You know, what are some of these larger ideas and concept of womanhood that you all would like to speak on? What has changed it, and what has moved us along?
I think one of the things that's very important for us to keep in mind, and for the audience to know, either learn or remember, is that 18th century women's circumstances are not necessarily the same as 19th century women's circumstances. In the 19th century, there's this growing domestication. Now, of course, this is for middle class and of white women, the expectation that they're going to be pure, pious, domestic, and submissive. That's a big expectation. What I will say about all of this, when it comes to looking at women's history, very often when I talk about history of enslavement, I talk about look to the courts. How are they being treated? With women, I'm going to say follow the money. Who has right to it, who has access to it, who gets to use it. You move through the 19th century, there's this whole thing about property rights. There's a reason it's property rights that comes, quote unquote, first for white women, because the idea being they don't have this. And the one that starts it all isn't Seneca Falls, it's not New York, it's not 1848. There's an instance, 1839 in Mississippi, where a woman sues to hold on to her enslaved property when a creditor comes to take her husband's all of his property, because she says, this person is mine, my father gave me this person. And it went to court, and she won. At the same time, they passed a law basically providing women's property rights. The reason they pass it, though, and everyone's proud of all the women involved, is to control the ownership and the movement of enslaved people. So here's the thing that we say, oh, the women fought. And yeah, they did. But they were fighting for something that we wouldn't necessarily think is good. Isn't good. And from that process, you begin to see it build, and it builds, and it builds, and it builds. And of course, there's this whole thing about the 15th Amendment, where the fact that women are not included in terms of who gets to vote after the Civil War. This builds and builds, and in the 1920s, of course, they have the ability. They have that ability. And then we build into sort of more modern feminism, which I imagine is going to probably come up in the course of what we're talking about. I feel very strongly, I want everyone to know about that Mississippi law, 1838.
Now, well, speaking of the law, I think that's a great segue. And a question for you all. We've spoken about the law of the past, and we're here in 2021. Would you all say that women today are equal under the law?
No.
Well, all right. So that was a pretty clear response. Barb, you are closest to me. How about, would you like to expand upon that?
And I'm not, it's not necessarily under the law, but it's just the attitude that women don't have the same, they're not afforded the same opportunities, say, as a man. For every dollar that a man makes, a woman's only going to make like 79 cents. And then if you're a minority woman, it's going to be even less. And so there are these inequities that women have to face. The fact that, and like in the 18th century, we have women at all different spectrums. You're going to have women that currently stay at home. We have a lot of women that are in the workforce. We have a lot of married women. Then we have women who are head of household. It's just kind of across the gamut. But for those women that work outside the home for money, they're making less money. But they still have some of the same responsibilities, say, as a married couple. And so they're trying to address, housing and childcare and those kinds of things. And then, depending on the type of employment you have, whether it's professional or non-professional, if a child gets sick and you have children, it's the woman who's going to be going to the school to pick up the child. And in some cases risking her ability to keep her job because she's left. In addition, women being in that caretaker role, many are also not only responsible for children, but they're responsible for older parents.
Right.
Because we're in this this time where we have, many people have children, but yet their parents are aging, and then they also have the role. So women are having to stretch themselves from each, spectrum of the age range in order to take, and it's usually not seen as a man's responsibility. It's more likely going to fall on a woman to take care of these kinds of things.
Exactly.
Now, for the whole panel, what would you say, what would you feel are some of the continued larger challenges for women in today's society? And all women, and also maybe we can begin to think about that idea, that intersection of varying women, whether it's race, class, status, all of that. What are some of the larger challenges, and also what are some new opportunities that you feel have evolved for women, as we've moved out of the, of course, 19th and 20th century and so on and so forth? And I open that for anyone to begin.
I'll start, and this is a heavy one. In general, I will say women my age and younger, we're very lucky in the fact that we can stand on the shoulders of giants. These women who have been agitating, who gave us lots of legal opportunities, but we're not done, and everybody treats it like it's done. Culture wars happened, we all go home. Some people aren't happy, others are, but everybody goes home. The answer is that's not true. And what I would say is that marital rape laws. It does not become illegal in all states of the Union until 1993. In Virginia, the law is set up in such a way that the husband, alleged rapist, goes to counseling with the intent of the family unit being preserved. That's so overwhelming that the state has this expectation, and this is the way they're going to structure it. I will also say with this kind of thing, People say, oh, I want to do something, I want to do something. Look at your state's laws and I'd say call or write your congressman, but we don't do that anymore. But contact somebody in your either local or above government, because this is a great example of a challenge that has not gone away.
I think another very important challenge is reproductive rights. You know, we saw that play out in the recent elections, you know, and they'll continue to play out. There are even, you know, women who are you know, on one side or the other of pro-life or pro-choice and so forth. But I think that was one of the things that kind of helped in the 1950s and beyond for women to be able to move beyond the domestic sphere when they were able to control their reproductive rights. So I think that's an issue that is certainly still relevant today and will continue to be relevant. I think the part that can continue to change that is more women in courts, more women as representatives in our state, local, national governments that can address these issues. So I think, you know, that's still an issue. That's still an important thing that we need to keep in the forefront. But we're also building some structures that can help to make that better as we move forward.
Yes.
I think another issue too is that if you look at people who are living in poverty, the majority of them will be women raising children. There's a term or an acronym called ALICE, and it's Asset Limited, Income Constrained, Employed. And really what that means is that people are having a hard time in taking care of their basic necessities: housing, childcare, transportation, medical care, those kinds of things. And so if you're already having a difficult time, you know, this is just adding to it. And, you know, oftentimes heads of households need to have more than one income to be able to make it work. And then, you know, that's additional money that goes to childcare. I mean, so it's this inequity of people not being able to make a living wage, and a significant number of women not making a living wage and being able to have those basic things taken care of.
And Barb, as you speak about that inequity, this has been an unprecedented year for all of us,
Absolutely.
right? For multiple reasons, but in particular, the COVID-19 crisis, the pandemic. Have you noticed it affecting women in a very specific way in your work?
I think, yes. The thing that I just said about Alice and being unable to take care of those basic needs, it's just gotten worse because for many women, their jobs went away, you know, they can't go back, or they've had to take care of their children at home, so they can't work because now they're having to homeschool their children. Daycare centers, some of them were closed for a long period of time, so if you had a job but you didn't have a place for your child care. And then also there were many people who had never had to ask for benefits of any kind, assistance with food or rent or things like that. And COVID-19 has really made a tremendous strain, an additional strain on people who were already struggling and having a difficult time just making ends meet.
Now, we are slowly getting to the end of our time together, but I certainly want to bring up something that has occurred in our country. And you know, we've spoken about this idea of intersectionality and how the law covers and doesn't cover women, and especially depending on who that woman is and what sort of place she takes up in the world. Well, the killings, the murderings that happened in Atlanta just a few days ago, where Asian American Pacific Islander women were targeted, and it's, you know, it's a lot to take in, right? But, you know, there's a lot of conversations of if it was misogynistic, was it racist, and all the blending there. But can we, do you all have any thoughts about that, and just how these things are still affecting varying groups, and especially oftentimes how women have to carry so much of other people's baggage that isn't their own? Yeah.
I think it demonstrates the truth of the quote it's attributed to Margaret Atwood. And it's a very simple quote. It's, men are afraid women will laugh at them. Women are afraid men will kill them. And I think, seeing what, the way he's been speaking and the way he's considered and these women, I think it's exactly true. And and the volumes turned up even more when we look at this intersectionally.
That it's, I think that it's really, it's heart-wrenching when you see that kind of thing happen over and over, particularly to communities of minority communities, if you will. The Black Lives Matter movement that was brought on by the various things that were happening with the police interacting with men and women of color. And then we see how this young man was treated, almost with kid gloves, and we've seen that before as well. So I think it just strikes at your heart to see that, especially in the 21st century, as we're moving forward and we've progressed. And I think you said it perfectly that we've come a long way, but we really still have a long way to go. And we're on that path, I think, as you talked about, that light at the end of the tunnel. But I think we still, all of us in our various communities and so forth, help as much as we can people to come to understand one another, come to an understanding of one another. You don't necessarily have to agree, but just come to an understanding of why things happen the way they happen, and how can we make it better.
Yeah, absolutely.
If that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. I want to propose a question to you all from Bonnie. Bonnie asks, how can we being women, how can we change the views of the men in our lives? And she's referencing brothers, sons, the men women encounter in the workforce. How can we change their views when it comes to valuing a woman's perspective and respecting the way in which women approach the world? And I open that to you all.
Well,
Barb, do you want to start? Sorry.
Yes, you want to go for it?
I guess one of the things that I would say is it's all about understanding and where somebody is coming from. I often feel or think about families that we encounter in human services. Oftentimes behaviors are because of a past trauma, and certain things will make that trauma come back, and it's the action that takes place. And so I think we need to understand, as women, and not making excuses for, but also understanding where the behavior is coming from. But I also think we need to help men to take responsibility for their actions and thinking about why they're doing the things that they do. And oftentimes it gets back to a trauma that has been experienced, probably, and even something that's been pushed back, and they're not even aware that it comes from or where it has come from. But I think it's men have to take responsibility for their actions, and they can't take out feelings on others because of the way that they're feeling.
Exactly. I think about a session that I went to at the National Multicultural Institute up in Washington, D.C., and it was called The Third Side. It was presented by, I believe it was Dr. Deborah Flick, and she is very instrumental in conversations. I hate to call them difficult conversations, but whether they be about race or whether they be about women, whether they be about economics, whether they, she talked about the third side, and she used the analogy of a coin. A coin has a head and a tail, but it also has a rim, and the rim is that third side, and the rim is where the head and the tail come together. And so, not taking anything away from the head, not taking anything away from the tail, but we have to kind of come together in that really small place, that's the rim, and start there. And then not necessarily wanting to change them automatically or quickly, but just so that they are aware of maybe, generational trauma, of language, of just those things that those really unspoken, those nonverbal things that also are detrimental to an interaction. But I think trying to find that third side where you can find that understanding and start there, and then branch out.
And Rose, that's a great segue as we prepare to wrap up. And Kelly, I would love to hear from you.
I was just saying this very. Oh, we don't have time.
No. You just might. If there's anything that you want to, if there's anything that you want to leave our audiences with about the legacy of women, or just expanding upon what Rose says, and everyone, maybe about 30 seconds or so, just what is the final thing that you would like to leave and impart with our viewers?
I'll start because it's tied to exactly that in terms of what do we do. And it's very simple, I think. It is, I've had this conversation with a lot of men, wonderful men, who will say, I would never do such a thing. I find that disgusting. Great, good, I'd never do, good. But what are you going to do when the guy sitting next to you does something? What do you do if you witness something over here or hear something over there? What are you going to do? And what I'd ask at this point, I'm not trying to be confrontational, I'm asking for quiet reflection to seriously consider what they would do. And to me, I would say that's the biggest thing I want to leave with, but the other is to younger women, so third and fourth wave feminists. The work is not done. The marital rape is only the tip of the iceberg. We act like it's all figured out thanks to the ladies in the 60s and the 70s. It is not true. We got stuff to do.
Barb?
I would say that women are resilient. Women find creative ways to reinvent themselves. During COVID, as bad as it was, women found ways to create new businesses. So women look at their strengths and then with their creativity come up with ways in which they can capitalize on that, whether it's preparing meals, or there were a lot of people making masks when we first had to make masks. Maybe it's childcare because there's a need there, or do you have some technical skills? Putting together Zoom meetings with facilitation or things like that. So it's women always find a way to continue when they get knocked down from something else. They are resilient and they find a new way for themselves.
And in closing, in a new way, Rose, you had said earlier about the election.
Yes. Well, actually about the appointment. Of our Secretary of the Interior, who is the first Native American Indian to be on any cabinet position, and she happens to be a woman, Representative Deborah Holland. And so how exciting is that? And the Interior Department houses the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the National Park Service, land conservation, all of those things that are so central in Native American communities. And now we have a Native American heading that group. Again, we've come a long way. We still got work to do, absolutely, a lot of work to do, but we're making those baby steps, if you want to call them, and we're moving forward. And I think about this analogy where someone says, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time.
And that, what a way to end, what a way to close. Now, with that, I'm afraid that is all the time that we have today, but I certainly hope that you all are able to take something away from this conversation that we've had. Don't let it stop here. Have the conversation amongst your families, your communities, and continue to push these ideas forward. Thank you to all of you for joining us today for Us, Past, Present, and Future, A Woman's Place. Thank you to Barb Watson, Rose McAvee, and Dr. Kelly Brennan. We're so glad that you all could join us today. And I also want to take this time to thank our donors, without whom programs like this could not happen. And our digital programs for Women's History Month have been sponsored by Ferguson Enterprises. So thank you especially to Ferguson Enterprises for helping Colonial Williamsburg tell a more complete American story. We'll see you all next month for a very special Us, Past, Present, and Future panel as we examine the question, what does citizenship mean as an American? Thank you again for your time and your viewership. Have a beautiful evening. Take care.